The last entry in Captain James Rothwell's journal was dated June 15, 1847, and consisted of a single sentence written in handwriting that had deteriorated from the precise script of earlier entries into something barely legible. "The ice shows no sign of releasing us, and I begin to understand that we may have sailed into a place from which there is no return." The journal was found 32 years later, wedged beneath a cairn of stones on a desolate stretch of coastline in the Canadian Arctic, its pages stiff with ice and salt, its leather cover cracked and faded by exposure to elements that seemed designed to erase all evidence of human presence. Inside were accounts of a voyage that had begun with such hope and confidence, detailed observations of landscapes and wildlife that had never been properly documented, increasingly desperate notations about dwindling supplies and deteriorating health, and finally those last few entries that captured the gradual realization that their grand expedition had become a slow march toward extinction in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. James Rothwell had been 38 years old when he departed from London in May of 1845, commanding a vessel called the Temperance on an expedition funded by a combination of Admiralty support and private investment from wealthy patrons interested in Arctic exploration. He was an experienced naval officer who had served in various capacities throughout the British Empire, a competent navigator and leader, though not particularly distinguished in any remarkable way. He was in essence exactly the kind of solid, reliable officer that the Royal Navy produced in abundance during the 19th century, capable but not brilliant, ambitious but not reckless, confident in British superiority and the rightness of expanding geographic knowledge into the blank spaces on maps. The expedition's stated objective was to chart portions of the Arctic coastline that remained unexplored, to search for evidence of the legendary Northwest Passage that European explorers had been seeking for centuries, and to conduct scientific observations of the region's natural features. It was the kind of mission that had become increasingly common as the 19th century progressed, as improved ship design and navigational techniques made previously inaccessible regions seem tantalizingly within reach, as competition among European powers drove them to plant flags and establish claims in every corner of the globe. The Temperance carried a crew of 47 men, a number that had been calculated to be large enough to handle the ship and conduct extensive exploration parties, but small enough that provisions could sustain them for an extended period if they became trapped in ice over the winter. The ship had been specially reinforced for Arctic conditions with extra planking on the hull, a heating system for the interior spaces, and stores of preserved food that represented the latest in Victorian-era preservation technology. Tinned meats and vegetables, dried fruit flour, salt pork lime juice, to prevent scurvy, and various other provisions that were believed to be adequate for a voyage that might last 2 or even 3 years if necessary. Among the crew were men from various backgrounds and with various skills. There was Dr. Edmund Hayes, the ship's surgeon, who also served as the expedition's naturalist and who kept meticulous records of every specimen of plant and animal life they encountered. There was Henry Shaw, the first mate, a taciturn Yorkshireman with 30 years of seafaring experience. There was Samuel Price, the ice master, whose previous experience in Arctic waters made him invaluable for navigating through ice fields. And there were the ordinary seamen, marines, and specialists who made up the working crew, carpenters and sailmakers, gunners and cooks, young men seeking adventure and older men seeking one more voyage before retirement. The voyage north had been uneventful by the standards of 19th century Arctic exploration, which is to say it had been difficult and dangerous but had not yet become catastrophic. They had stopped at Greenland to take on additional supplies and to hire Inuit guides who might assist with hunting and provide local knowledge of ice conditions. They had pushed north and west through increasingly congested ice fields, following leads of open water when they appeared, waiting out periods when the ice closed in around them, making slow but steady progress toward their objectives. Rothwell's early journal entries reflected confidence and even excitement. He described the austere beauty of the Arctic landscape, the midnight sun that never quite set during the brief summer, the wildlife they encountered. Seals and walruses, polar bears viewed at cautious distance, countless seabirds whose calls echoed across the water. He recorded detailed observations of ice formations, of currents and tides, of magnetic variations that made compass navigation increasingly difficult as they pushed north. He wrote about the crew's morale, which remained generally high despite the hardships, and about his own sense of purpose, his conviction that they were engaged in important work that would expand human knowledge and bring honor to Britain. But as summer gave way to autumn and the ice began to consolidate rather than melt, the tone of the journal entries shifted subtly. There was a recognition, never quite stated explicitly but increasingly evident in the language Rothwell chose, that they were not going to achieve their objectives that season, that they would need to winter over in the ice and hope that the following summer would provide better conditions for completing their mission. This was not unexpected. Many Arctic expeditions had to winter over, and they were provisioned for it. But it was nonetheless a disappointment, a deviation from the optimistic timeline they had imagined when departing London. They found what seemed like a reasonably protected anchorage in a bay on the southern coast of an island that was not marked on any of their charts. The ice had frozen solid around the ship by late September, and they settled in for the long Arctic winter. The crew erected canvas shelters on the ice around the ship to provide additional storage and workspace. They organized hunting parties to supplement their provisions with fresh meat. They established routines of work and recreation designed to maintain both physical health and mental well-being through the months of darkness that lay ahead. Dr. Hayes's journal, which was found alongside Rothwell's, provided a different perspective on that first winter. Hayes was more introspective than the captain, more inclined to reflect on the psychological effects of their isolation, more attuned to the subtle signs of stress and illness among the crew. His entries documented cases of frostbite and snow blindness, the occasional conflicts that arose when men were confined together in cramped quarters for months on end, the growing anxiety as winter stretched on with no sign of the sun returning. But Hayes also recorded moments of beauty and even joy. The aurora borealis dancing across the night sky in displays of green and purple light, Christmas celebrations where the crew sang traditional songs and shared extra rations, the gradual return of light in late February when the sun began to peak above the horizon for a few minutes each day, growing longer until it finally remained visible for full days and eventually for the 24-hour cycle of Arctic summer. Spring brought hope that they would be released from the ice and could continue their mission. But spring in the Arctic is a deceptive season, promising but often failing to deliver. The ice around the temperance did soften and crack, but it didn't break up sufficiently to allow them to sail. They remained trapped, able to send out sledging parties to explore the surrounding territory, but unable to move the ship itself. Rothwell organized extensive sledge expeditions that spring and early summer, teams of men hauling equipment and provisions across the ice to chart the coastline, to search for any signs of open water that might indicate a navigable route, to hunt for game, to establish supply caches that might be useful for future expeditions. These journeys were brutal. Temperatures could drop to dangerous levels even in summer. Storms could arise with little warning. The ice was treacherous with pressure ridges and thin spots that could swallow a man before his companions could react. One sledging party, led by Henry Shaw, was gone for 6 weeks and returned with 3 men suffering from severe frostbite that required Dr. Hayes to amputate fingers and toes. Another party, searching to the north, found what they believed might be evidence of a previous expedition. Fragments of wood and metal that could have been from a ship or could have been driftwood and natural deposits. The interpretation uncertain, the find tantalizing but ultimately inconclusive. The physical toll was immediate and severe. Men who had seemed relatively healthy at departure began to fail within days, their bodies unable to sustain the level of exertion required for hauling heavy sledges across difficult terrain, while subsisting on minimal rations. Frostbite was constant. Scurvy symptoms worsened despite their attempts to find and consume any edible plants they encountered, and a general weakness born of years of marginal nutrition made every task exponentially harder than it should have been. They lost the first man after 8 days. a young seaman named Thomas Cooper who simply collapsed while hauling and died within hours, despite Dr. Shaw's attempts to revive him. They buried him in a shallow scrape in the ice, marking the spot with a cairn of stones and a rough wooden cross, and continued on because there was nothing else they could do. Over the following weeks, more men died or became too weak to continue, and had to be left behind with minimal provisions and faint hopes that they might somehow survive until help arrived. Rothwell's journal entries from this period are almost unbearable to read, stripped to bare facts recording deaths and distances, temperatures, and ice conditions, with almost no emotional content except what can be inferred from the increasingly shaky handwriting and the occasional sentence that breaks through the detached tone to reveal the anguish beneath. "We are dying," he wrote after they had been traveling for a month and had lost half their party. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, inexorably being ground down by this place that cares nothing for our courage or our determination or our desperate desire to live. They found occasional signs of life, tracks of polar bears and Arctic foxes, the remains of old Inuit camps, seabirds that suggested they were approaching coastline or open water. These discoveries provided brief moments of hope, suggestions that they were making progress toward inhabited regions. But each time, the hope proved premature. The coastline would dead-end into more ice fields. The Inuit camps would prove to be ancient, decades or centuries old. The wildlife would disappear again into the vast whiteness. By mid-July, they were down to 8 men, all of them severely weakened, all of them understanding that they were probably not going to make it, but continuing anyway, because stopping meant immediate death while continuing offered at least the illusion of agency. They had consumed all their provisions except for a few days' worth of pemmican and some tea. They were traveling now in a kind of trance state, putting one foot in front of another through sheer force of will, no longer really believing in rescue or survival, but unable to conceive of any alternative to continuing. It was in this state that they found the cairn, a man-made structure of carefully piled stones, on a prominent point of land overlooking a frozen bay. Cairns were used by Arctic explorers to mark significant locations, to cache supplies, to leave messages for other expeditions. Rothwell and his remaining men approached it with desperate hope that it might contain provisions or at least information that could help them. What they found instead was a message from another expedition, dated 3 years earlier, indicating that this party had also been trapped by ice and was attempting to reach civilization. The message asked any who found it to report their fate if possible, and to inform their families that they had died in the service of geographic discovery. It was signed by a Captain Michael Forrester, commanding a ship called the Resolute, and it listed the names of the men who had left the message and were attempting to travel south. The discovery was devastating in its implications. Another expedition, traveling this same route, had not made it. Forrester's party had either died somewhere between this cairn and civilization, or they had reached civilization, but had been too weak or too few to mount a rescue expedition. Either way, it suggested that the route Rothwell had chosen was not viable, that they were following in the fatal footsteps of others who had failed. Rothwell added his own message to the cairn, a document that was found by the expedition that discovered his journal 30 years later. The message was brief and formal. Captain James Rothwell, HMS Temperance, and surviving crew members passed this location July 18, 1847. We are attempting to reach Hudson Bay. Provisions exhausted, crew severely weakened by scurvy and starvation. If this message is found, please inform the Admiralty and notify our families. God save the Queen. He placed his journal in the cairn as well, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, reasoning that if they died before reaching help, at least there would be some record of what had happened to them, some account of their journey that might be useful to future expeditions, and that might bring closure to the families waiting for news that would never come. The final entries in Rothwell's journal were written in the days immediately after leaving the cairn. The handwriting had deteriorated to the point of near illegibility, the sentences fragmentary and disconnected, suggesting that he was writing in a state of advanced exhaustion and possibly delirium. He noted the deaths of 2 more men, bringing their party down to 6. He described hallucinations, seeing ships in the distance that weren't there, hearing voices having conversations with dead crew members. He wrote about the ice, always the ice, endless and indifferent, beautiful and terrible, the medium of their slow destruction. The last dated entry was June 15th, though that date was almost certainly wrong. Rothwell had lost track of time, and based on other evidence, the actual date was probably late July or early August. The entry consisted of that single sentence about understanding that they had sailed into a place from which there was no return. After that, nothing. No more journal entries, no more messages, no more traces, except for the cairn and its contents that would be discovered 3 decades later by another Arctic expedition that was trying to chart the same territories, and that would face many of the same challenges that had destroyed Rothwell and his crew. The party that had remained with the Temperance fared no better, though their end was slower and even more completely documented. Dr. Hayes continued keeping his journal through a third winter and into the following spring, recording the gradual decline of the remaining crew members, the final abandonment of the ship when it became structurally unsound, the futile attempts to survive in camps on the ice, and finally the deaths of the last survivors, including himself. Hayes's final entries were found by an Inuit hunting party in 1853, nearly 6 years after the Temperance had become trapped. The Inuit found the journal in a tent that contained the frozen bodies of Hayes and 3 other men, the last survivors of the stay-behind party. Hayes had continued writing almost until the moment of his death, his entries becoming shorter and more disconnected but maintaining a scientific detachment, even as he described his own dying. "The cold is no longer uncomfortable," he wrote in one of his last entries. "My body seems to have lost the ability to generate heat, and I feel a kind of numbness that I recognize as the beginning of the end. It is strange to observe one's own death with clinical interest, to note the symptoms and progression as I would for any other patient. I find myself curious about what comes next, though I do not expect to be able to record it." His final entry was dated April 3, 1848, though again the date was probably approximate. "I can no longer feel my extremities, my vision is narrowing. I am very tired. I hope someone finds this journal and understands that we tried. We tried very hard. Please tell my wife that I thought of her at the end. Please tell my children that their father died doing what he believed was important work. Please." The sentence ended there, unfinished, the pen trailing off the page. Hayes had died while writing, documenting his own extinction to the very last moment, maintaining his commitment to observation and record-keeping even as his life ebbed away. The journals and messages left by Rothwell, Hayes, and several other crew members who had kept sporadic records were eventually compiled and published, becoming important documents in the history of Arctic exploration. They provided detailed information about ice conditions, wildlife, geography, and the challenges of surviving in extreme environments. But they also served as cautionary tales, warnings about the limits of human endurance, and about the dangers of underestimating the Arctic's capacity to destroy even the best equipped and most determined expeditions. The fate of the Temperance and her crew influenced subsequent Arctic expeditions, leading to improvements in equipment, provisioning, and planning. Future expeditions brought more extensive stores of preserved food, better clothing designed for extreme cold, more realistic timelines that acknowledged the possibility of multiple winters trapped in ice. They also developed better protocols for abandoning ships and attempting overland travel, based on analysis of what had gone wrong for Rothwell's party, and for other expeditions that had met similar fates. But despite these improvements, Arctic exploration continued to exact a terrible toll. The environment was simply too harsh, too unpredictable, too indifferent to human presence for safety to ever be guaranteed. Throughout the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th, expeditions continued to disappear or to return with devastating losses, each one contributing to the growing body of knowledge about the Arctic, but each one also adding to the roster of those who had ventured into the ice and never returned. The Temperance herself was never recovered. The ice that had trapped her eventually crushed her hull, breaking up the timbers and scattering the wreckage across the sea floor. Inuit hunters occasionally found pieces of the ship washed ashore, sections of planking with British naval markings, fragments of equipment, bits of personal belongings that had somehow survived the destruction. These artifacts were collected and eventually made their way to museums, where they joined the physical remnants of other failed expeditions, material evidence of ambition and tragedy, of the price paid for expanding the boundaries of human knowledge. The families of the Temperance crew members endured years of uncertainty before finally accepting that their loved ones were not coming home. Some had received the letters that had been left with the stay-behind party, and that were eventually found and forwarded by subsequent expeditions. These letters provided some closure, final words from husbands and fathers and sons, expressions of love and regret, hopes that their sacrifice had served some larger purpose. But many families never received such letters, either because they had never been written or because they had been lost with the men who carried them. These families were left with only the official notification that the expedition had been lost and that all hands were presumed dead, with no details about how or where or when, no last words, no graves to visit. It was a particularly cruel form of loss, one that denied them even the small consolations that usually accompanied death. In London, a memorial was erected to the Temperance expedition and to other Arctic expeditions that had ended in disaster. It listed the names of all crew members, their ranks and roles, and bore an inscription about duty and sacrifice and the advancement of geographic knowledge. The memorial became a site where families could come to mourn, where they could stand before the carved names and feel some connection to the men who had died in service to an idea, to the belief that expanding human knowledge justified the risks and costs of exploration. But the memorial also became a site of controversy and debate. Some viewed it as a noble tribute to brave men who had died pursuing important objectives. Others saw it as a monument to futility, to lives wasted in pursuit of goals that might not have justified the sacrifice, to a kind of imperial arrogance that sent men to die in the Arctic for reasons that had more to do with national prestige than with genuine scientific necessity. This debate intensified as more details emerged about the conditions aboard Arctic expeditions, about the inadequacy of provisions and equipment, about the poor decisions made by commanders, who were often more concerned with completing their missions than with the welfare of their crews. Critics pointed out that many Arctic disasters could have been prevented with better planning, with more realistic acknowledgement of the dangers, with greater willingness to turn back when conditions became untenable, rather than pressing forward out of pride or ambition. The debate was never fully resolved, partly because it involved fundamental questions about the value of exploration and discovery, about what risks were acceptable in the pursuit of knowledge, about the relationship between individual lives and collective advancement. These were not questions with clear answers, and different people came to different conclusions based on their values and priorities. What was clear was that the Arctic had claimed hundreds of lives during the age of exploration, that it had destroyed dozens of ships and expeditions, that it had created widows and orphans and devastated families. The romance of Arctic exploration, the adventure, the heroism, the pushing of boundaries, was built on a foundation of tremendous suffering and loss, and that suffering was borne disproportionately by the men who actually ventured into the ice and by the families they left behind. Dr. Eleanor Marsh was one of the researchers who studied the Temperance expedition in the late 19th century. She was a physician and anthropologist who had become interested in Arctic exploration through her work with Inuit communities in northern Canada. She had learned their languages, studied their survival techniques, and had become convinced that European explorers could have learned much from indigenous peoples who had thrived in the Arctic for thousands of years. This indifference was perhaps the most difficult thing about Arctic exploration, the aspect that the journals captured most effectively. The explorers had invested their journeys with tremendous significance: national honor, scientific progress, personal achievement, religious duty. But the Arctic itself recognized none of this significance, cared nothing for their purposes or their sacrifices, remained utterly unmoved by their suffering. It was simply a place operating according to physical laws, hosting various forms of life that had adapted to its conditions, existing without meaning or purpose except what observers chose to project onto it. For men like Rothwell and Hayes, raised in a culture that placed enormous emphasis on duty and honor and the importance of completing one's mission, This indifference must have been profoundly disorienting. They had been trained to believe that determination and proper conduct would be rewarded, that the universe operated according to moral principles, that sacrifice in service of worthy goals had meaning even if it ended in death. But the Arctic challenged all these beliefs, demonstrating daily that the universe was not structured around human moral frameworks, that determination could be entirely futile, that sacrifice might serve no purpose at all. The journal showed them wrestling with this realization, trying to maintain meaning and purpose even as evidence accumulated that their mission had failed, that they would die without achieving their objectives, that their suffering would not advance any of the causes they had hoped to serve. It was a kind of existential crisis documented in real time, a confrontation with meaninglessness that they faced not in philosophical abstraction, but in physical reality, in the daily struggle to survive in an environment that seemed designed to kill them. Some readers found in this struggle a kind of nobility, the refusal to surrender meaning even in meaningless circumstances, the commitment to maintaining human dignity and purpose despite the indifference of the universe. Others saw it as tragic delusion, an inability to accept reality, a waste of final days and hours that could have been spent in peace rather than in futile determination to complete missions that no longer mattered. Perhaps the truth was somewhere between these interpretations. Or perhaps different crew members experienced their final days differently, some finding meaning in their continued efforts while others simply endured. The journals could not capture every individual experience, could not represent all the private thoughts and feelings of 47 men facing death in the Arctic. They were partial accounts, limited perspectives, fragments of a much larger story that would never be fully known. In the 21st century, the Arctic became a symbol and a battleground in new ways. Climate change was rapidly transforming the region. Melting ice that had persisted for millennia, opening sea routes that had been impassable in Rothwell's time, creating conditions that were simultaneously easier for human activity and profoundly concerning for what they indicated about global environmental change. The Northwest Passage that Rothwell had sought finally became reliably navigable, not through human skill at navigating ice, but through the disappearance of the ice itself. This achievement of a long-sought goal came with a bitterness, success not through triumph over nature, but through damage to natural systems, a victory that felt more like defeat. Researchers returned to sites associated with the Temperance Expedition, studying how the landscape had changed, how climate shifts were affecting the preservation of artifacts and human remains, how the physical evidence of 19th century exploration was being impacted by 21st century environmental transformation. Some artifacts that had been preserved by cold for more than a century were now decomposing as temperatures rose. Some bodies that had been naturally mummified were beginning to deteriorate. There was an urgency to this research, a sense that history itself was being lost as the environment that had preserved it changed. But there was also a poignancy. The Arctic that had killed Rothwell and his men was itself dying, being transformed into something different, losing the characteristics that had made it so challenging and so deadly to 19th century explorers. New expeditions traveled to Cairn Point and Rothwell Bay, not to explore uncharted territories, but to document what was there before it changed or disappeared. They photographed and measured and collected samples, creating detailed records that could be preserved even if the physical sites themselves were transformed beyond recognition. They read the journals and tried to retrace the paths that the Temperance crew had followed, trying to understand what the men had experienced, trying to connect past and present across the gap of nearly 2 centuries. Some of these modern explorers reported feeling a strange connection to the 19th century expedition members, a sense that despite all the differences in technology and knowledge and circumstances, they were engaged in similar fundamental activities, traveling through difficult environments, documenting what they found, trying to make sense of places that resisted easy comprehension, confronting their own limits and vulnerabilities in the face of powerful natural forces. The dream of the Arctic had changed, but had not disappeared. It was no longer primarily about discovery and conquest, about planting flags and claiming territories for empires. It was more about understanding and preservation, about studying fragile ecosystems and documenting changes, about learning from the past mistakes rather than repeating them. But it remained a dream, remained a vision of a place that offered something not available in more settled and comfortable environments, a kind of clarity, a stripping away of pretense, an encounter with fundamental realities about human fragility and natural power. And people still died there, though less frequently and usually under circumstances quite different from what Rothwell and Hayes had faced. They died in accidents, aircraft crashes, ice giving way, storms overtaking researchers who misjudged conditions. They died from the same basic vulnerabilities that had killed 19th century explorers: cold, hunger, exhaustion, the failure of human physiology to cope with extreme conditions. The technology had improved, the knowledge base had expanded, but the fundamental fact remained: the Arctic was dangerous, and it continued to claim lives. The journals of the Temperance Expedition thus remained relevant not just as historical documents, but as reminders of what had not changed: the capacity of extreme environments to overwhelm even capable and prepared people. The importance of humility and realistic assessment of risks, the value of learning from those with more experience and knowledge, even when those teachers came from unexpected sources. On the 200th anniversary of the Temperance Expedition's departure, a memorial service was held at Cairn Point. Descendants of crew members made the journey, along with historians and Arctic researchers and representatives from various indigenous communities whose ancestors had witnessed the expedition's tragic conclusion. They stood in a landscape that looked simultaneously the same and completely different from what Rothwell would have seen. The fundamental geography unchanged, but the ice conditions dramatically altered by 2 centuries of climate change. A plaque was installed at the cairn, adding to the one that had been placed there decades earlier. The new plaque acknowledged not just the British explorers, but also the Inuit people who had found and preserved the journals, who had tried to help the expedition members whose knowledge might have saved lives if it had been heeded. It represented a more complete and more honest accounting of what had happened, one that recognized multiple perspectives and multiple forms of expertise. The service included readings from the journals, those haunting final entries that captured the explorers' realization that they would not survive, that their dreams of discovery and triumph had transformed into a slow march toward extinction. In the Arctic silence, with ice creaking in the distance and wind whistling across the barren landscape, those words carried tremendous power, connecting past and present, reminding everyone assembled of what had been sacrificed and what had been learned. "We sailed into a place from which there was no return," Rothwell had written, and that sentence resonated across 2 centuries, speaking not just about physical geography, but about choices and commitments, about how easily ambition could become entrapment, about how the pursuit of dreams could lead to nightmares. It was a warning and a lament, the acknowledgement of failure and the assertion of having tried. A last message from a man who knew he was dying, but who retained enough consciousness and determination to leave one final record. As the sun moved in its shallow arc across the Arctic sky, still the midnight sun of summer, still creating the strange perpetual twilight that had so disconcerted 19th century explorers, the assembled group stood in silence, each person processing in their own way what it meant to stand at this place where men had died, where journals had been left, where history had been made through suffering and loss. The Arctic dream had never been realized in the form that Rothwell and his contemporaries had imagined. The glory and triumph they sought had eluded them, transformed into tragedy and cautionary tale. But something had been achieved nonetheless. Knowledge that had made subsequent exploration, safer records that had advanced scientific understanding, stories that had reminded generations of readers about human courage and vulnerability, about the price of exploration and the value of learning from failure. The dream of the Arctic persisted transformed, but still compelling, still drawing people to these remote regions, still promising something that couldn't be found anywhere else. An encounter with the extreme, a testing of limits, a reminder of human smallness in the face of vast natural forces. Whether that dream justified its costs remained debatable, a question each person had to answer for themselves based on their own values and their own assessment of what mattered. What was undeniable was that the Arctic had shaped human history and human consciousness in profound ways, that the explorers who had ventured into the ice and never returned had left marks that extended far beyond their brief lives, that places like Cairn Point and Rothwell Bay would continue to serve as memorials and lessons for as long as humans remained interested in pushing boundaries and seeking knowledge in the most challenging corners of the Earth. The journals remained, carefully preserved now in climate-controlled archives, digitized and accessible to researchers and curious readers around the world. Their pages frozen in time as surely as Rothwell's body had been frozen in Arctic ice, their words still capable of transporting readers into that lost world of 19th century exploration, of making real the experiences of men who had sailed toward the top of the world and had found not glory but death, not triumph but endless ice, not return but only the vast white silence that swallowed them all.